Charles Darwin's Around the World Adventure. Jennifer Thermes. Charles Robert Darwin would have rather been outside searching for bugs, beetles, worms, butterflies, birds, rocks, and bones than sitting in a classroom. His teachers didn't think he was very smart, but Charles spent hours sorting through the treasures he found. Charles loved collecting. Once, when his hands were full with 2 beetles, he popped a third one into his mouth to bring it home. It squirted something bitter and he had to spit it out. Charles was sad to lose that beetle. Charles tried to be a doctor like his father, but the sight of blood made him queasy. So he studied to become a clergyman. While attending Cambridge University, he took long walks with his professors, exploring the countryside. It was his favorite part of school. After graduation, Charles' professor of botany wrote a letter recommending him to the naturalists aboard the HMS Beagle. The ship's mission was to take map measurements of South America. Charles would be able to explore new places all around the world. He was thrilled. His father thought it was a wild scheme, but he finally let Charles go. The Beagle set sail heading west around the globe. She was only 90 feet long and packed tight with sailors and supplies. A man named Robert Fitzroy was her captain. Charles was very seasick, but the excitement of seeing palm trees and an island made by a volcano soon made him forget the ocean swells. On a tiny group of rocks in the middle of the sea, he decided he would write about all he saw on his journey. In the rainforest, the ground soaked up the downpour while the plants grew green and lush. Charles was surrounded by the buzz of millions of insects, yet the jungle wrapped him in velvet silence. The landscape was so different from anything Charles had known in England, he was giddy. He collected butterflies, beetles, spiders, and lizards to send back home. At the end of every day, he wrote in his journal. He made big observations about the tiniest of creatures. Charles was happy to stay on land and explore while the Beagle sailed up and down the coast. The land didn't churn his stomach and make his head spin. He galloped with gauchos across the dry plains of the Pampas and camped at night with his saddle for a pillow. Charles found 8 kinds of mice and giant fossil teeth. He saw a rare bird called a rhea that used its wings to steer as it ran, but could not fly. He discovered that some creatures were good for eating. Roasted armadillo made a tasty breakfast. Charles dug up ancient dinosaur bones buried on the beach. How many of these huge creatures once roamed the earth? Why had they disappeared? He studied the rocks and tried to figure out how steep cliffs and flat plains were formed. Was it possible that the shape of the land affected the animals' survival? The Beagle sailed farther south through the rough seas as wind and rain whipped the sturdy ship. Once Charles, Captain Fitzroy, and a few sailors were exploring the shoreline in small boats 100 miles from the Beagle. Suddenly, a huge chunk of ice crashed from a glacier into the sea. The wave it made almost destroyed their vessels. The men were lucky. It would have been nearly impossible to survive in the cold, desolate land with no way to call for help. The weather was so bad it took almost a month to try to sail around Cape Horn. They finally had to turn back and crossed the Strait of Magellan. Under the frigid waters of Tierra del Fuego, forests of seaweed waved back and forth, teeming with life. The kelp was food for fish and crabs and microscopic creatures, which in turn fed birds and otters and seals. The bigger animals couldn't survive without eating the smaller ones. Charles saw how their lives were all connected. The Beagle zigzagged up and down the long coast of Chile, while Charles took trips through the countryside, meeting the ship along the way. A chain of mountains towered over the land. How had they become so huge? One night, boom! A volcano exploded like fireworks in the sky. A few weeks later, the ground groaned and shifted. The earth rumbled far within, and a massive quake shook the land. Charles was 200 miles away from the center of the earthquake, but he wrote in his journal that it felt like he was standing on thin ice. Far out at sea, a giant wave formed from the motion of the earth and rolled toward shore. It swallowed villages and swept them away. When Charles saw the destruction, he was shocked, but he noticed that the earth was a few feet higher than it had been before. Could the volcano and the earthquake and the changes to the land be related? He had found his answer. Up, up, up in the rose-colored shadows and snowy peaks of the Andes Mountains. Seashells! Fossilized seashells were embedded in the rocks, thousands of feet above the ocean. Charles was sure that the Andes must have been underwater a long, long time ago, and that the earth was always shifting from deep inside, sometimes slowly, sometimes suddenly. With enough time, these movements could make mountains higher than clouds in the sky. He was so excited by his discovery that he forgot how hard it was to breathe in the thin mountain air. After almost 4 years of exploring, it was time to start the long voyage home. But first, the Beagle would stop at an archipelago more than 500 miles off the coast of South America called the Galapagos Islands. The islands were made of black volcanic rock. Charles was amazed at the creatures in this isolated place surrounded by the sea. They were not afraid of humans. It was magical. There were 4-foot-long lizards that lived on the beach but hated water, and there were 200-pound tortoises big enough for Charles to try to ride. Charles counted many kinds of finches across the islands. They were related to one another, yet birds from different islands had different shaped beaks. He wondered why. Years later, Charles learned that some finches had small beaks because they ate tiny seeds, and some had big beaks strong enough to crack hard seeds. Their beaks had changed over time depending on what food they ate. The birds had adapted to where they lived. The Beagle spent 1 month wandering around the Galapagos, then headed west again. The ship was stocked full with barrels of water and food, including tortoises for eating. Crates full of rocks, shells, insects, birds, and bones packed every corner. Sometimes the sailors were annoyed because Charles' treasures cluttered the deck, but after years of traveling together, they admired how hard he worked. As the Beagle blew across the sea, Charles spent hours in his cramped cabin organizing his notes and specimens and writing in his journal. He was beginning to have new ideas about how the earth was formed and how animals evolved in order to survive. All that he had seen so far was making sense. Charles now knew for sure that he would be a scientist when he returned to England. The natural world would be his life's work. By now, everyone was homesick, but the ship still had a few more stops to make. There were coral reefs that seemed so fragile, yet were strong enough to protect small sandy islands from pounding ocean waves. And the coral was alive! It was made of tiny polyps that grew on top of mountains sunken far beneath the water. Charles saw again how the land could rise and fall. It was always changing. After one more stop in Brazil, the Beagle sailed back to England 5 years from the time she had left. Fair winds blowing her homeward. When Charles returned to his family, his father said that the shape of his head had changed. Perhaps it had grown larger. With knowledge, Charles knew he had much more work to do in the coming years. There were still so many questions to answer, and he needed to be sure of his ideas. His journey of discovery would continue for the rest of his life. He would study worms and pigeons and barnacles and write about what he had learned. And what he wrote would change the world forever.